The IDF has begun moving ground forces into the Gaza Strip, invading from the north and the south and once again severing northern Gaza from the rest of the Strip. Hamas fired rockets towards Tel Aviv and Ashkelon, while the Houthis have fired ballistic missiles at Jerusalem. Airstrikes also being reported throughout Gaza. What areas has Israel taken over in the Gaza Strip? What are the stated war aims of the current return to fighting? Where do things stand in the negotiations? I'm Alon Burstein. Let's dive in. On Wednesday, March 19th, the Israeli military began moving ground forces into the Gaza Strip, effectively beginning its second invasion of Gaza since the war began. The military has called the current move Operation Might and Sword. I only mention that because that is an important indication that at present time, Israel is viewing this invasion as a defined and possibly limited operation. In other words, it's not just part of the ongoing war where the IDF was moving from region to region. This is a defined operation being given its own name, at least at the present time. The IDF has thus far carried out 4 major moves on the ground. First, on Wednesday, the military retook a substantial part of the Netzarim corridor, once again blocking the main Salah ad-Din road in the Gaza Strip. The corridor effectively divides northern Gaza from the rest of the Strip, which is, I will say, right around here, and the Palestinian population, which for the first time was allowed to return north in January once the truce began, once again is restricted in their movement. They are now only permitted to travel south along that main road. The coastal Al-Rashid road remains open to Palestinians at this point to travel in both directions. However, no vehicles are allowed on that road, and pedestrian traffic can go either north or south. Again, that is, at the present time, the IDF has only retaken part of the Netzarim corridor. By Thursday, the IDF began moving troops into the northern coastal area of Beit Lahia, that is up here in the Gaza Strip, working reportedly to expand the buffer zone that it established along the border with Israel. Substantial artillery fire was reported by Palestinians on the ground in the last several days. The IDF has reported that it attacked Hamas militant infrastructure and anti-tank launching sites throughout Beit Lahia. By Friday, it was reported that the military is expanding its operation in the Beit Lahia region, moving into the Al-Atatra region as well. Meanwhile, on Thursday, the IDF reported that it is expanding its operation to southern Gaza as well. The IDF reportedly invaded the Shabora region of Rafah, that is the eastern parts of Rafah along the border with Egypt. In addition to that, on Thursday, it was reported that the IDF issued evacuation orders to Palestinians in the Bani Suhaila region in Khan Yunis, that is the eastern parts of Khan Yunis. And also following Hamas rocket fire from northern Gaza, it was reported earlier today that the IDF issued evacuation orders from other neighborhoods in northern parts of Gaza City, specifically El Salatin, El Karama, and El Uda. So all those regions are parts that the IDF is signaling that it is possibly going to expand its ground operation as it continues. In addition to the ground invasion, airstrikes are also being reported throughout the entire Gaza Strip. Major bombings have been reported in the northern areas of Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun, as well as in the central regions of Al-Nusayrat refugee camp, as well as in Khan Yunis. The IDF has seemingly been focusing its airstrikes on Hamas's attempt to rebuild its governing apparatus in the Gaza Strip. A majority of the attacks have been reported targeting key offices and officials within Hamas's governing structure, i.e. specifically targeting more of the political wing rather than the military wing. Among others, some key figures have been assassinated over the last several days. These include Issam Da'alis. He is a member of Hamas's political bureau and the de facto Hamas prime minister in the Gaza Strip. Mahmoud Abu Watfa, he's the head of Hamas's internal affairs office, and very important, he was the person who was in charge of Hamas's police system. Rashid Jahjouh is the head of Hamas's general security services. He's someone who is very, very important in Hamas's internal intelligence mechanism. He can be compared to the Secret Service or the General Security Service in Israel. He's the person who was in charge of building Hamas's intelligence when it comes to actual internal intelligence, not fighting Israel, but instead building up its forces and its governing capabilities on the ground. In addition to that, also Ayman Attila was reportedly assassinated. He was the head of Hamas's General Security Services in the Khan Yunis region. In addition to those political figures, some militant figures were also assassinated over the last several days. These include the spokesperson of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who is known as Abu Hamza, as well as Usama Tabash. He was the top Al-Qassam field commander, was assassinated in Khan Yunis. The Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip has reported that in the series of airstrikes, according to some reports, between 100 and 130 airstrikes have been carried out over the last several days in the Gaza Strip. over 590 Palestinians were killed, 1,042 were injured. I remind everyone the Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip does not distinguish between militants and civilians. They are reporting the amount of bodies that have gone through Gazan hospitals. In Israel, it was not reported how many of those killed are estimated to be militants. What was reported was a list of those figures who were assassinated. In terms of what are the stated goals of Israel returning to fighting, what does it want to achieve? I remind everyone that the first phase of the ceasefire expired on March 1st, and since then there were supposed to be negotiations to enter into the second phase of the ceasefire and a complete end to the war. Israel has refused to negotiate that. That was part of the first agreement. However, Israel has said that it wants to negotiate a more limited ceasefire, and Hamas has refused to negotiate that. Since then, we were in sort of a limbo state with the truce being extended without any effective negotiations. Since the return to fighting began, the Israeli government has repeatedly stated that it wants to renegotiate the terms of the ceasefire and accept the proposed limited deal of the U.S. Special Envoy to the region, Steve Witkoff, and that the military operation that is now being launched is due to Hamas's refusal to negotiate this. Over the last several days, however, the rhetoric has somewhat changed after it was stated that Israel is returning to fighting in order to pressure Hamas into the negotiation. The Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz began stating that until Hamas releases all hostages, Israel will increasingly not only take over territory in the Gaza Strip, but also intends to annex the territory that it takes over in the Gaza Strip as a mechanism of punishing Hamas, trying to encourage it to agree to hostage release. On Friday, Israel Katz's statement went even a step further. He stated that Israel is still willing to accept Steve Witkoff's proposal, but he also added that he has ordered the IDF to continue to take over territory and to permanently hold it in the Gaza Strip, adding that Israel will, and I quote, intensify fighting from the air, sea, and land, and expand the ground maneuvers until the release of the hostages and the defeat of Hamas, using all military and civilian pressure, including evacuating the Gazan population southward and carrying out U.S. President Trump's plan for the willful evacuation of the people of Gaza. What we are seeing here is that the rhetoric has gradually changed over the last several days. At first, it was stated that the military pressure is going to be applied in order to bring Hamas back to the negotiating table. Then it was stated that the military pressure is going to continue until the release of all hostages. Then today it was escalated further with the Israeli Defense Minister saying that the military pressure is going to continue and expand until Hamas is defeated, and that Israel plans to go forth with President Trump's plan of the quote-unquote willful evacuation of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. In a moment of analysis trying to understand, so what is Israel trying to achieve here, I'll say that at this point it seems that Israel is hoping that the military pressure will compel Hamas to come back to the negotiating table and accept a more limited hostage deal without a declared end to the war. That's what Israel would like to see, a hostage deal that will focus maybe on 5 or 10 hostages and allow for a temporary truce, and then the fighting can possibly resume. I will also add that it's important to look at the macro picture within Israel and Israeli politics, not just at the war. The return to fighting at this point was very favorable for Netanyahu's government. The government was substantially strengthened by the return to fighting and the fact that as a result of that, the Jewish Power Party has returned to the coalition in the last several days. And this comes 2 weeks before a crucial budget vote that the government had to have a majority for, otherwise the government would automatically fall. Now there's been a return to fighting. The Jewish Power Party has returned to the coalition. What I'm saying here is that we are very likely going to see that at least until that budget vote that happens in the Israeli government, we are going to see a gradual return to fighting, even if Hamas was willing to have a complete return to negotiations at this moment. Likely we will see the situation continue to progress at a very slow pace until the government secures that majority that it needs in the budget vote at the end of the month. Turning to Hamas's response to the ongoing invasion, in what has been a very surprising development, the movement has yet to engage the IDF forces on the ground. No gun battles have been reported, neither by the IDF, nor by the Al-Qassam brigades, nor by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. More than that, despite the fact that the IDF repeatedly stated throughout the ceasefire that Hamas was engaged in actively booby-trapping roads and planting roadside bombs and mines, there's yet to be a single attack reported against the IDF forces, despite the fact that they have moved into the Netzarim corridor into key strategic places that Hamas, at least according to reports, was engaged in planting those roadside bombs. The only militant response from the group thus far has been the 2 barrages of rockets that it launched. Those are 3 rockets that it launched towards Tel Aviv, and 2 rockets that it launched towards Ashkelon. Now, several people have asked me in the last several days, is this possibly an indication that Hamas's forces are depleted and the group is effectively defeated militarily and cannot engage with the IDF? I'll say that, thus far at least, this does not appear to be the case. The group was engaged in active fighting against the IDF right up until the moment that the truce was declared, so it had enough forces to continue fighting the IDF until the truce was declared. It was also reported both by the IDF and the Al-Qassam brigades that during the truce, Hamas was actively engaged in recruitment, it was running very accelerated training camps. So at this point, it appears to be more of a strategic decision that the group is not engaging the IDF, rather than the fact that it is incapable of doing so militarily. So what is the strategy behind this? Right now, I would say that it is likely that Hamas is trying to bide its time in order to in the hopes of keeping negotiations alive. Hamas hopes that the negotiating countries are going to compel Israel to return to the ceasefire and carry out phase 2 of the agreement. At this point, Hamas vastly prefers to move towards a ceasefire and have the IDF withdraw from the Gaza Strip rather than plunge back into many months of fighting. I'll say also that the group is very likely aware of the internal political turmoil in Israel and of the fact that surveys in Israel show the majority of the population is in favor of continuing with the hostage deal. It is also therefore possible that Hamas wants to avoid fanning the flames of war at this point, hoping to create a trajectory where both internal and external pressure will be mounted on Israel in order to accept phase 2 of the ceasefire. Again, I'll say that is speculation on my part. However, from a global perspective, I will say it is almost unprecedented that a terror group is holding territory and there's a military that is actively invading that territory and almost goading the group into fighting, and the group is thus far not really engaging. Hamas has issued several statements calling for a return to negotiations every time the IDF is invaded again. Instead of fighting in the Netzarim corridor, Hamas has lodged an official complaint, called upon the United Nations and the United States to stop Israel from violating the deal. At this point, Hamas is seemingly favoring keeping negotiations alive rather than engaging in active fighting. Before I conclude, there are 3 more developments related to the war from the last several days that I'm not going to develop here, but it is worth mentioning and worth remembering them because they are going to become increasingly important. The first is the decision that was taken by the Israeli government on Thursday to dismiss Ronen Bar, that is the head of Israel's General Security Services, which is sometimes in English referred to as the Shin Bet. I'm going to try to put out a special video about the importance of this move. Here, what I'm going to say is that it's important to note that Bar was one of the key figures in all hostage negotiations up until now. He's one of the instrumental figures in securing those hostage deals, and thus his possible removal will likely have a serious impact on the trajectory of the war. The second thing that I'm going to mention is the blockade of humanitarian aid from coming into the Gaza Strip. After the substantial increase in the entrance of humanitarian aid during the truce, once phase 1 of the truce ended, Israel cut off the entrance of all aid into the Gaza Strip. No aid trucks have been allowed to enter the Gaza Strip as of March 2nd. Now, with the increasing of the fighting, the internal pressures and shortages in Gaza are likely to lead to an external pressure on Israel to allow aid to come into the Gaza Strip. This may eventually lead to the involvement of the International Court of Justice. In the past, it has compelled Israel to allow aid to flow into the Gaza Strip without any restrictions. Again, I'm mentioning that here, there hasn't been any movement on that in the last several days, but it is likely to become one of the factors we're going to hear about increasingly as the invasion continues. The third is the increased involvement of the Houthis in their renewed fighting, alongside the absence of involvement of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has made harsh statements, but has not even threatened to join the fighting in this round. They seemingly are seeing themselves as out of the game at the present time. In turn, the Houthis have fired 3 ballistic missiles and 2 different barrages towards Jerusalem and towards Israel's national airport in the last several days. U.S. forces are carrying out airstrikes in Yemen, and the United States asked Israel to not retaliate to those missiles from the Houthis. But that is another facet that is important to note. Again, at this point, hasn't shaped the trajectory of the war, but it may end up having more bearing as time goes on. Obviously, we'll learn more as the invasion continues. That is my highlight on the recent return to fighting in the Israel-Hamas War and the IDF invasion of the Gaza Strip. If you find these highlights informative, please do remember to send them out to anyone you think might find them interesting. Hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications if you want to know when reports come out. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'm Alon Burstein. I'm a visiting assistant professor and an Israel Institute fellow in the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. Thanks for watching.